Good morning. My name is Lyle Morris, Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy and National Security at the Center for China Analysis within the Asia Society Policy Institute. I'd like to welcome everyone to this morning's panel on Xi's EU diplomacy, the view from France, Germany, and the United States. Chinese President Xi Jinping just wrapped up 2 days of meetings in Paris, where he met with French President Emmanuel Macron and EU Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen. It is safe to say a lot was on the agenda for Macron and the EU, to include concerns over Chinese industrial goods flooding the EU market, Chinese EVs, and the war in Ukraine, just to name a few. Xi was in Europe for the first time in 5 years at a time of growing business tensions between the EU and China, and as several countries in Europe and elsewhere are re-examining trade ties with Beijing. Given so much at stake, the Center for China Analysis is pleased to be hosting this webinar this morning to hear from experts in the region about the significance of the trip for China's relations with France, but also widen the lens to discuss China's broader approach to relations with Germany, the EU, and the United States. Given Chancellor Scholz's recent trip to China and meeting with Xi, and given the prominent role that Germany and France play in China's relations with Europe, we wanted to discuss what these 2 trips by Xi mean for China-EU relations and China's foreign policy going forward. So, to help us break all this down, I'm pleased to be joined by 3 distinguished panelists. The first is Philippe Le Corre. He is a senior fellow on foreign policy for the Center for China Analysis and a senior advisor on geopolitics to Asia Society France, and he is joining us from France. Philippe is not only a distinguished scholar on Chinese foreign policy, he has previously served as special advisor to the French defense minister and as Northeast Asia analyst with the French MOD. Next, we have Dr. Nadine Godehardt, senior associate in the Asia Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. Nadine also advises the German government and Bundestag on questions regarding China's domestic and foreign policy. And finally, we have Neysun Mahoubi, director of the Penn Project on the future of US-China relations at the University of Pennsylvania. In addition to being a well-known scholar on Chinese foreign policy and US-China relations, Neysun has led several transatlantic dialogues on US-China-EU relations, most recently in Paris. So with that introduction, Philippe, Nadine, and Neysun, thank you for joining me today.
Good to be here.
Thank you, Lau. Looking forward.
So we've got a lot to discuss. Like I said at the beginning, we have about an hour for the discussion. So I'm just going to jump right in. Hopefully by this point, you 3 have had a chance to maybe absorb the readouts from the meeting between President Xi and Macron. Now he is off to Hungary and Serbia for the second leg of his trip to Europe. So given his very high-profile meeting with Macron, the first trip to Europe in 5 years, just kind of your broad overall takeaways. I'm curious what you thought of the meeting, and did anything surprise you? And I'm going to start with Philippe for that question.
Thank you, Lyle. Well, I think the first thing to point out really is that once again, President Macron was not alone when he received President Xi. As last time, a year ago in Beijing, and as in 5 years ago, when he received the Chinese leader alongside the president of the European Commission and the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, he received President Xi with Mrs. von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Commission. Now, the reason I start with this is this was announced literally a few hours before the Chinese leader landed in Paris. And I don't believe this was particularly welcome on the Chinese side, especially on the year of the 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations between France and the PRC. I also want to point out, by the way, that this 60th anniversary is symbolic, especially in Chinese eyes. But I suppose it's an anniversary, and we know that China is very fond of anniversaries. But if I can remind the audience, in January 1964, General Charles de Gaulle was French president at the time, decided to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing 13 years before the United States. And he pointed out that, well, of course, we, France are not going to necessarily approve the Chinese political system, but France has no choice but to recognize the word as it is. I think in many ways, what Emmanuel Macron has been trying to do over the past few years, especially for the past 12 or 15 months, when things have become quite difficult, really, with China after 3 years of COVID, and of course, after the start of the war in Ukraine launched by Vladimir Putin. He has tried, as he has tried with Putin and with others, to engage with the Chinese leadership, just because China is a prominent player. And because as we all know, there is this US-China rivalry, which is at full swing, as I'm sure my colleagues would acknowledge. And therefore, he, the president of France and a prominent member of the EU, but of course he's not the only one, as my colleague Nadine will probably acknowledge as well. He thinks he can possibly engage with the Chinese leader on a number of global issues, including climate change. He said that the Paris Accords that was signed in 2015 would not have been signed without President Xi's agreeing with President Obama at the time. He's saying that, the question of international debt is extremely important, and only China talking to the West can help sort it out. And finally, there's the question, there are many other questions, but there's the question of the war in Ukraine, which of course he has tried last year to convince the Chinese leadership to help with and to help convincing Putin that he should stop the aggression against Ukraine. Now, it didn't really work in the sense that, of course, the only thing that Macron got was a phone call to President Zelensky by Xi Jinping a few days later. But as we know, he was then off to Moscow immediately and spent 3 days in Moscow with his friend without limits, Vladimir Putin. And as we speak, President Xi is still in Europe and is on his way to Belgrade for another anniversary, not so glamorous, the 25th anniversary of the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy, which of course China has been accusing the United States and NATO of being responsible for. But he will also be seeing Vladimir Putin at the end of May, a few days after Putin has officially been inaugurated for a 5th term as president of the Russian Federation. So the outcome of this visit, in many ways, and I will pass on to my colleagues, is very mixed. First of all, from a Chinese point of view, being seen on a commemorative visit by the president of the European Union or the European Commission, who has so many critical things to say about the lack of level playing field, and the various concerns about supply chains that the European Union has, and also with regard to the huge trade deficits that the EU has with China. Now, the reception, the global reception by the French side was not as glamorous and as grand as it was on the 50th anniversary, for example, just 10 years ago, when President Xi visited France, and I was in Paris at the time. And globally, I would say that the Chinese entourage could feel that we are in a different environment. We are indeed in a very different geopolitical environment, but also the mood has shifted. And I think the expectations were rather low. And at the end of the day, a question should be asked: what will be left of this visit to France? And will France be able to play the role it was aiming at, especially in the absence of the German Chancellor? But we'll hear about that very soon, especially because Chancellor Scholz was in Beijing himself very recently. But at least, there was this sort of common message sent to China via the presence of Mrs. von der Leyen.
Mm. Nadine, from your vantage point in Germany, you follow, obviously German-China relations quite a lot, but just overall from your vantage point, like what did you think about, what were some of your broad takeaways from the visit that stuck out to you?
Yeah, I think just to add to what Philippe already said, I think what is kind of interesting is that Macron is capable of acknowledging China's role in the world as a superpower on the one hand, but on the other hand is also putting European and French interests on the table, at least rhetorically. So I think that is something that he played out quite well, at least from a German point of view. At this point, this was something I think was very much regarded here. I guess what surprised me was the number of agreements and joint statements that were actually signed, because that, particular from a Chinese point of view, is usually seen as as a very big takeaway for Xi Jinping. I mean, this is something that he can deliver at home. We all know that in the Belt and Road Initiative, signing cooperation agreements or joint declarations is something that is seen as more as a symbolic, also again, acknowledgement of China. So I think this was clearly planned quite in advance, but still the amount of, I think, 18 agreements and joint declarations on important issues such as the Middle East were quite surprising, I guess. And we will see what will come from that, because signing agreements is one thing, implementing the ideas is something different. I guess another issue that was kind of surprising for me was von der Leyen's role in this meeting. I think the last time in Beijing last year, she, at least the German press, saw this trilateral meeting rather critical, in the sense that the German press was of the opinion or discussed that Macron more or less outperformed von der Leyen in Beijing. And so she was a little bit sidelined by Macron. And I think this time she was very well prepared. And she had her talking points very clear on the table. And also, I think that she quickly presented the press statement after the trilateral meeting, was also very important, because it sort of set the tone of the narrative. And I think in that press statement, she very much highlighted again the problem of overcapacity, which probably during the trilateral meeting, at least that would be my educated guess, maybe was not covered too much, but she really, I think, could a little bit influence the discourse at this point. So I think that was something, particularly if we compare it with the meeting in Beijing, I think stands out here. Also, you could see a little bit also the difference between maybe the French perspective and the European perspective here.
Mm. And so, Neysun, over to you. You're a keen follower of China, obviously, for a long time now, and you're based in the U.S. But just from your vantage point, what takeaways did you kind of stuck out to you from this meeting?
Yeah, to start by echoing one of the points of my dear colleague Philippe, and building on Nadine's interventions as well. The first thing that I think is worth underscoring is the theme of continuity in France's relations with China over many decades. I don't think France is the first Western country to establish diplomatic relations with China. I believe the UK precedes France by about 10 years, but still they're significantly earlier than the United States. And this visit also occurs on I think the 49th anniversary of Deng Xiaoping's 1975 visit to France, which is the first visit by a Chinese leader to a Western country. So, France, I think, has demonstrated over many decades that it is forward-leaning as compared to many other Western countries, and especially the United States, in trying to find some kind of accommodation with a regime in China that obviously, has many aspects that are in tension with the ideals and values of Western countries. That said, there were a few things that I did find noteworthy in this meeting. The first is just the fact that Xi Jinping is going to Serbia and Hungary. As far as I know, and Philippe can correct me if this is wrong, but for a very long time, the understanding on the French side was that he was just coming to France. And I believe it's more recently that the Chinese kind of, surprised their French counterparts by saying, oh, by the way, he's also going to go to Serbia and Hungary. And of course, that 25th anniversary of the NATO bombing in Belgrade, I'm sure was not a surprise to the planners of that add-on visit. As you said, Lyle, at the beginning, I don't think we were necessarily expecting Ursula von der Leyen to join in France. And it does underscore that President Macron has, I believe, been playing kind of a good cop, bad cop routine in a number of these interactions with President Xi Jinping, including when he took Ursula von der Leyen to Beijing with him in his state visit to China. I think he is clearly trying to, position himself as having one kind of messaging with China, but bringing along bad cop Ursula von der Leyen as well. Even if he's not, for example, in the visit to China, she didn't have the same kind of pomp and circumstance around her being there, but it does seem strategic on the part of President Macron. Another thing that I found noteworthy was the way in which Xi Jinping sort of tried to message some degree of neutrality vis-a-vis the conflict in Ukraine by saying quite explicitly that China was not an instigator to the conflict, was not a participant in the conflict. And what I think is important here is that it seems to have finally really dawned on the Chinese side that the Ukraine war is a problem for their efforts to develop their relations with Europe as a wedge against the U.S. It is, I think, apparent to all that the very negative dynamics between the U.S. and China are the primary thing on the minds of Chinese foreign policy thinkers and the leadership. And so a lot of what they're doing is in the shadow of that tension. And so I think on the one hand, they've clearly wanted to sort of develop leverage with Europe vis-a-vis the U.S., but at the same time, and for the same reason of trying to kind of negotiate around the tension with the U.S., they have this, no limits partnership was announced with President Putin right before the invasion. And for some reason, it took a while, I think, for the Chinese side to really understand how much the, support, rhetorical support and other kinds of support for President Putin's war effort in Ukraine was really undermining their effort to develop Europe as a wedge against the U.S. And just the kind of wording that Xi Jinping used, I think, reflects that, and we could say whether or not it was effective, whether or not it did the job, but he's clearly trying to signal something to European counterparts. Of course, as we were discussing a little earlier before the webinar, that he still is using very pointed language vis-a-vis the U.S. and how the U.S. is interacting with the war in Ukraine. So, that part of it still remains quite pointed. But he's clearly trying to signal to European counterparts, like, we've heard you. This is how we see ourselves playing a more neutral role in this conflict. Don't let that diminish our efforts to develop ties with each other that could be separate and distinct, and in some ways a wedge against the relations with the U.S.
A lot that I want to pick up that all three of you said. So let's dig into a few of these issues that you all raised. And first, just to set the context, I'm sure you're all aware of Macron's Sorbonne speech. Very pointed, hard-hitting, kind of a wake-up call, I would call it, about the threats posed by Russia. But he also included some passages about China, a lot about trade with China being, we need to be more realistic about relations with China when it comes to being over-reliant on trade. So kind of given that speech that Macron gave a few weeks ago, and then now you have Xi visit and you have van der Leyen, being in that meeting, it seems like Macron has quite a balancing act to kind of threading a needle of France's relations with China, France's relations with Germany and the EU, and balancing all those various interests into, how he navigates that with China and Xi. Clearly, EU concerns about Chinese subsidies was front and center. You had, obviously human rights concerns by France about China. So, and then of course, Neysun, as you pointed out, the Ukraine war, which this is a big diplomatic issue, and I think Macron is kind of taking the lead on the negotiations with Russia and China on Ukraine. So given those different stakes, and then you had the presence of von der Leyen, who I think it was Philip, you said, you started off by saying, unclear how Xi and China viewed her presence there. It'd be interesting to see kind of as we see the readouts, what China, felt about her presence, because clearly they have overlapping but divergent interests, and she seems to be Neysun, as you said, the good cop, bad cop, which I think is a good analogy here. So I guess given the speech that Macron had, and then this kind of focus on unsustainable trade with China and Ukraine, maybe Philippe, I'll start with you. How do you think Macron did on those issues, navigating those? Do you think he got some wins? Did he get what he wanted? Or do you think it's kind of, we have to wait to see, how it all turns out?
So it's hard to say whether he struck a success or just a fine line, so to speak. As a kind of anecdote, I have to say that a couple of days before President Xi arrived, there was a public or a private meeting, I would say, at the presidential palace. And he was pictured with the leader of the Tibetan government in exile. And in the same room, the unofficial representative for Taiwan to France was also present. Now, these messages were obviously sent to the people who were blaming the French government for welcoming the dictator and so on coming from China. He was sort of covering himself by doing this. There was actually a picture of him with the Dalai Lama dating from 2016. And we all know these kind of messages are not welcome in Beijing, to say the least. But at the same time, as I was saying, setting the stage at the beginning of our conversation, I think the general atmosphere was clearly different from 10 years ago when he came for the 50th anniversary, when the Eiffel Tower turned out in red completely, and when there was red carpet everywhere. The Palace of Versailles was welcoming the Emperor of China, so to speak. This wasn't the case this time. Now, as we speak today, he was actually in the Pyrenees with the president of France in the village where he used to spend vacation with his grandmother. Now, this is a sort of charming touch to show the intimacy between the two leaders. But let's be serious for a moment. We know that it's very difficult to get intimate with somebody like Xi Jinping. And we know that at the end of the day, to be more grave and serious because this is no subject for laughing. We are in a year where 50% of the world population is voting. We are in a year where we have European elections for the European Parliament in June, when indeed the subject of China's rise, China's presence, China's unfair practices, and China's human rights violations, and friendship with Putin have become a topic for politicians to discuss. And finally, we have the US elections in November, and we have President Biden coming to France for another celebration, the D-Day landing celebration in a few weeks. So Macron is sort of standing in the middle of all this as a middle power, but not many actually leaders these days. The other one is the German chancellor can actually speak to the Chinese leader and make points that need to be made, including on unfair practices on trade and overcapacity, which of course China has denied entirely. And on Ukraine and on the Middle East, these are subjects which, of course, need to be addressed by Western powers to China. But it's become very difficult to have a conversation. I'm not sure China really wants to have a conversation because, as we know, it is more interested in talking to countries of the South. And as we saw from the BRICS summit last year, as we saw from the absence of Xi Jinping to the G20. So that was not a Southern summit he wanted to attend, obviously, because it was held in Delhi. But generally, Xi Jinping is more interested in talking to non-West countries. So, who in the West can actually address these issues? France is one of them. Germany is one of them. And then we've got the second half of the week in Hungary and Serbia, and I'm just going to answer Neyson's comment. I think that these two places were rumored to be on the tour for quite some time, not necessarily in that order, but it is of course embarrassing for France and for everyone really, just because these two countries, their leaders attended the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing last October. Alongside Vladimir Putin, the two European leaders that were there, Vučić and Orban. And last but not least, Viktor Orban, who has become a very difficult member of the European leader to deal with. He's going to be the chair. He's going to hold the rotating chair of the European Council in a few months. And obviously that hasn't escaped China either. Not to mention the massive Chinese investments in these two countries. And these are countries that China like, and this will send a very good message to a Chinese audience that we have close friends in Europe. We have France, maybe an old partner of some kind, a Western country for that matter. And then there's Hungary and Serbia. These are real friends we can do business with and that are welcoming the Chinese narrative and the Chinese Belt and Road and things like this.
Nadine, what do you think? And also curious, when I was reading the readouts, I noticed that van der Leyen took a little bit of a stronger line on trade. She was very direct about, calling trade with China unsustainable and unbalanced. You didn't see the same kind of direct language from Macron. So given kind of, the readouts of a little bit good cop, bad cop, and Xi, a little bit kind of defending himself on Ukraine, how do you think Macron came out of this meeting? How does he look after this meeting?
Yeah, maybe let me get to some point that Philippe made. I mean, 10 years ago, maybe she was treated as the empire of the past, But today, it's more like the empire of the future, maybe, So this is, I think, also a reality that Europe has to face. I mean, China, in many ways, is not a hegemon. It's not looking for followers in the sense maybe a benign hegemon like the US was looking for, and creating alliances in this very traditional idea of realism. But if we look at China as some kind of modern form of empire, it's really more about creating peripheries, you know. So creating peripheries within Europe. It's so from a Chinese perspective, made total sense to go to Serbia and Hungary, while also going to France. So in that sense, it's also our perspective of China that needs to change. You know, we are still looking at China dealing with terms like great power, superpower, that are more aligned to the United States. But China, and maybe particular China under Xi, developed practices that very much are similar to imperial practices, without maybe the military touch to it yet. So that is something I think is quite obvious, and you see the difficulties to deal with this complexity, because it's something that is very new for Europe. It's very new for the European Union, and I think in that sense it makes good. There's good reason for reaching out to Xi Jinping together. And I think there was a lot of criticism also in Germany that Scholz didn't join the meeting. I think usually the reasons why this didn't play out are maybe not as political as people want them to be, but probably just bureaucratic. But still, I mean, he was in Paris for the dinner, and I guess there is I'm very sure there is intense cooperation between the foreign offices. So it's not that both leaders run into opposite directions. I think they do have a very different style, but I think the overall message is very similar. Because you mentioned the Sorbonne speech, I think what Macron is very good at is that he really can point out the importance of the situation. So, I mean, saying that this is really about the survival of Europe or the idea of Europe is something that not many leaders in Europe say, you know, and it's something that is maybe very important to hear, particularly before you meet such an important country leader such as Xi Jinping. So I think this is again, it's a very smart, I think, strategy of using language to somehow get different messages to different audience. And again, I also like the good cop, bad cop idea. I guess von der Leyen has a very clear message here. The European Commission published a clear strategy on economic security. They have a very clear path on how they want to deal not only with China, but with issues regarding unfair trade or a security risk in that direction. So I think she made her point, and she did it also in the past. I think von der Leyen's language, von der Leyen's points never really changed since last year. So there is a continuity in her language describing why they need to de-risk, why also on the other hand there need to be cooperation in other fields. And she's very consistent in her language, in her message, I think, on the one hand. And so Macron probably also knew what to expect inviting her over. And he can obviously, as the host of the event, use this for his own message to deliver. Regarding Ukraine, I think the positions are quite settled, to be honest. You know, she even published an article before he came to France, where he also repeated his position on Ukraine. I think all sides know that they have a different view of this war in Ukraine, and all sides also need to repeat their positions in these diplomatic meetings. However, the question is what comes after this exchange of disagreements, you know? So, and that's, I think, the point where we are at the moment. From my view, or my impression is that Macron is a little bit more realistic on China's position towards Ukraine, in the sense that he is understanding but not agreeing with the Chinese position. trying to maybe find some other space of exchange. And I think highlighting that they keep on having intense dialogue on this issue is maybe not a win, but it's maybe the only thing that we can get at the moment to be very realistic about the situation with China. So this is it's difficult, and I guess even von der Leyen was again highlighting that the Chinese side put some effort in persuading Putin to not use nuclear weapons. Now we have the situation that at the day she landed in France, Putin announced the military drill where he wants to use tactical nuclear weapons. So who is speaking to whom here? How much influence does China really have? This is something, I guess, and Philippe also mentioned this briefly, we will see after she met with Putin. And then maybe in the following weeks, we see some change in movement of goods that can be used for military use, or maybe some different language that is used. But these are all, to be very honest, only nuances.
Neysun, let me turn to you for a U.S. perspective. And Nadine, you mentioned the article that she published, the op-ed in the French newspaper. And, I read it, and it was, what you'd expect, which is China, really emphasizing, that China's open to trade and open to the wider world, her cooperation with France and other countries. But then you had Xi, specifically say decoupling would hurt, France, would hurt the EU, but also the global economy. So kind of given, what Nadine and Philippe just said, but also from a U.S. perspective of, and, your experience in France, what effect do you think that Xi's message, his op-ed, his comments had on Macron in Paris, but also in the U.S., who's watching this meeting, very intently?
Sure. And I can't resist thanking Nadine for referring to the U.S. as a benign hegemon. I really appreciated that from our German friends. So a couple of points. First, just sort of like grading Macron. I think, he's set for himself a task with a high degree of difficulty. Starting from understanding how toxic U.S.-China relations are, where, I've been thinking a lot recently about how within the U.S., even in this moment of relative stability in the rhetoric towards China and around kind of mutual actions, there is still, I think, a very robust perspective that in extreme form is that we are locked in some kind of an existential struggle with China over the future of civilization. I don't think everyone in DC thinks that, but a lot of people think that. And in a lot of ways, the direction of travel, even in this moment of stability, I think is sort of oriented in that direction. And I think Macron is very clearly trying to stake out a position that there are lots of concerns about China, including everything we've talked about, economic concerns, concerns about sort of China's support for actors like Putin's Russia. But he does not believe that the West or France, Europe are locked in an existential struggle, that there is room for dialogue, there is room for trust building, there's room for exploring a cooperative partnership. He's trying to do that while also signaling that on kind of core values and interests, France is clearly most strongly aligned with its longtime ally, the United States. So, he's set up a task with some degree of difficulty, and also, I should add, kind of positioning France within the European context. Macron clearly thinks of himself as a leader not just of France, but of Europe. And, messaging to other countries within Europe and to the Commission is part of this very challenging task he set for himself. And, going back to the trip to Beijing, which is, the same dynamics in that trip, I think a lot of people would say that, maybe people wouldn't agree with exactly the positioning that he's trying to establish, but he did a relatively good job of kind of navigating all of those difficult shoals until the interview with Les Echos, where he made a clear mistake. He clearly, I think, not only American observers, but including many French and European observers would say that his language in that interview at the end of the trip, with specific reference to the Taiwan issue and potential support for Taiwan, was sloppy at best and, undermining Taiwan at worst. On this occasion, I think it's fair to say he has not yet made a mistake. This very difficult task that he set for himself. Again, not everyone's going to agree with the kind of positioning that he has sort of been trying to establish, but he has not made a clear mistake. And so my suggestion to the team around President Macron would be put him on lockdown for a few days to just make sure he doesn't make a mistake, because sometimes he has that tendency, after everything has gone well, to somehow mess it up. So just put him on lockdown for a few days, for a week, just take the win on this trip and just get past this danger zone of him saying something in an interview or an offhand comment that undermines all the work that he's done that I think, fairly we could say has been effective. So that's my report card on President Macron. But then the next question is, for all of this effort, what's he getting in return? Is Xi Jinping giving him anything tangible that you could say rewards to some degree what he is, he's this positioning that he's established that he wants to try to do, and in many ways has done successfully on this trip. And I think that, I think in many ways the jury is still out. One thing that I was interested in, and I don't know if Philippe thinks this is important, but the Chinese ambassador to France, Liu Shaoye, is a loose cannon who says lots of frankly crazy things. And if Xi Jinping really, really wanted to, indicate some degree of, I hear you and I want to, demonstrate our good faith here, he might change that ambassador. And it's just very interesting to me that, that Liu Shaoye is still the ambassador of China to France. There's no change in that. And so it would be interesting to me if there was some more objective metric that, something like that would reveal something. It would say, he hears him, he's going to give him something to demonstrate that all of this effort that Macron is undertaking yields something tangible that you could say, shows some change in the Chinese position. And I'm not sure we've seen that. And I'm not sure we will see that, because in the next week, Xi Jinping is obviously going to these other countries and then welcoming President Putin. So he's now thinking about those things and less something positive to give to France.
Put him on lockdown. I like that.
I'm sure Philippe might appreciate that too.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to get a pair of keys and well, I'm not sure among the two people you just mentioned, I'm not sure which one I would lock down first, but it's possible that returning Ambassador Liu to Beijing might be actually helping relations between France and China, which obviously has damaged a great deal. It's unbelievable in 5 years how much damage an ambassador can do. But actually, he's proven that. And hopefully he's coming at the end of his term after 5 years. But as you know, he's popular among certain people in the Chinese leadership. But he's not popular among a lot of French citizens, that I can tell you, and certainly not the media. In fact, China's image in Europe and in France in particular has suffered a great deal from comments against the French social system, medical system, about you don't go about insulting the country where you're posted. Generally, I would say, Nadine mentioned, deals and things. I'm always very skeptical of deals, contracts, MOUs. We know how much China loves MOUs. These 10 MOUs, they come and go. There wasn't an Airbus deal this time, in fact. And there was the suspension of the tariffs against cognac was announced for 2 weeks. How generous is that? As I recall very briefly, the trade sanctions against cognac were meant to be a countermeasure from China against the investigation, the probe, really, that the European Commission has been conducting against Chinese state-subsidized electric vehicles. And of course, cognac is a 99.9% French product, and I don't believe other countries are really much affected by this. The other thing that was announced was that French citizens will be allowed to go to China without a visa for an extra year until the end of 2025, at least for 2 weeks. That's not only France, by the way. That's all kinds of other European countries. Now, these are small measures, which of course China considers as part of the win-win. But there are also irritants from the Chinese side as the sort of the European dimension of this meeting, which was not necessarily planned, and the fact that both Macron and von der Leyen came up with lists of complaints about trade deficits, about state subsidies, about supply chains, and all these kind of things. Not to mention relations with Russia. And generally, I would say just one final word. I mean, the French business community has changed, has shifted moods on China. It's certainly not as enthusiastic as it was in the past. The mood was more gloomy. There was a seminar in Paris near the Élysée yesterday. And I can tell you, people, the finance minister, the head of the pro-China lobby, so to speak, were all speaking about level playing field and things like that, which they were not in the past. And this is, by the way, there might be some discrepancy with the German situation. I'd love to hear Nadine speak about that, because as we know, there are different groups in the German industry as well.
Philip, you teed up my next question so well that before I turn to Nadine on German issues, I just wanted to kind of transition from that to, the context of EU relations with China, I think, has really changed. As you saw in the last, 2 months, there's been a raft of, high profile issues with China, whether it's like intelligence issues, arrests of Chinese nationals, raids of a Chinese equipment surveillance manufacturer called New Tech, looking for foreign subsidies. You had the arrest of an aide to far-right German lawmaker of the EU on suspicions of spying for China. You have all these industrial, economic kind of more stricter policies against targeting China. There's some on Xinjiang, there's some on labor, then there's, of course, the one on EVs. So, I mean, just that overall list of things, it seems to be, I mean, I don't know whether you all three would agree with me, but just the last 3 to 4 months of kind of high profile, controversial issues related to China, how has that changed Europe and especially Germany and France's view of China? And do you think that was reflected in this meeting, or do you think that it was kind of more under the surface, and then during these high profile meetings you have Macron kind of put on a good face and be very diplomatic and not kind of bring to bear some of these pretty major concerns about how China's acting in Europe? Philippe, maybe I'll come to you, and then Nadine and Neysun.
So, I mean, Macron was heavily criticized for welcoming, as I said before, welcoming Xi Jinping for all these human rights abuses and things like that. But actually, I was listening to some media comments over the past 2 days, and at the end of each conversation, there was always somebody saying, well, we still need to speak to China. So it may reflect fairly well what the Sorbonne speech or what the various statements that have been put out are saying that, if nobody speaks to China from Europe, what's going to happen in a very changing, geopolitical and dangerous environment, including in the Indo-Pacific. By the way, the Indo-Pacific or Asia was not mentioned very much in the past 2 days, just because there's a war, in Europe, and that is the prime concern of most European leaders. I would say that yes, the mood has changed. In the business sector, fewer CEOs are enthusiastic about the China market. That is a clear difference with Germany. Even the human rights activists, of course, have been pushing against this trip. Some politicians running for the European Parliament have been complaining about this trip. But again, this is a different type of receptions than the one we had 10 years ago. And I agree with Nadine, we are dealing with a different China and a much more assertive and ambitious regime. And therefore, the reception was, I think, fairly adequate to the fairly low expectations of the French side, and the presence of the European Commission head was welcome because it gave a kind of more pan-European dimension to this conversation. At the end of the day, even from a Chinese point of view, China is very keen on multipolarity. We need to try, that's the Sorbonne speech again for you. We need to try to build this European pole. Of course, it's a very complicated business. People are trying to divide Europe, including China, by the way. And at least, every attempt that will try to bring us together when we speak to the United States or to China or to India is, I think, welcome at this very moment.
Nadine, what do you think about the raft of kind of news about, some of them were directly related to Germany, this Chinese national who was an aide to the German lawmaker. And do you think that any of this has changed the mood in Germany about its relations with China? And then you had, of course, Scholz's visit to China, which was, he brought a bunch of businessmen and seemed to have a very, positive meeting as far as German business interests are concerned. But what do you think about some of those issues?
Yeah, I think many of the issues that you mentioned, they are not just recent developments. This is, I always think of a wave, that is traveling over the sea. And we don't know if it turns to a tsunami at some point, and for whom it actually turns into a tsunami. So this is going on for a long time already. And even before COVID, I think the atmosphere was at least cautious. But obviously in the last 5 years, we saw big changes. And this is... But this is a process. It's not just happening overnight. And that is also important. There's a history to the idea of minimizing dependency from China. There's a history to why suddenly supply changes are important to Europe or also to Germany. There's a reason why subsidies are seen different than maybe at times where economic relations were also a little bit different when it comes to the strength of the participating countries. So in many ways, it's not only China changing, it's also obviously our European, French, but also German systems are changing. Our economy is dealing not only with China, but with a very fragile international order. And that is particular for Germany as an export country, very difficult. Maybe just a footnote to the German business. I mean, German business is very diverse. It's usually when it's talked about the German business, we think about the big companies, Daimler, the car industry, or BASF, the chemical company in China. But these are the big ones. I mean, they now their idea of de-risking is to put their business into China and more or less create a Chinese business, and all their profit goes back into Chinese investments. So it's a China in China de-risking, which is questionable if that is actually what von der Leyen meant with de-risking. But obviously, smaller and medium enterprises, they already are diversifying from China. And I think there are no new investments from these types of enterprises into China. It's getting to different or other countries. So I think we already also see change within Germany, but I think the debate is still dominated by the big companies. But so that is clearly something that was very much aligned to Scholz's visit to China, but it's not the whole story. I mean, I also think that this complex relationship that we are always highlighting, that also von der Leyen highlighted in her press statement, it also, I think, to me, it also highlights a different thing, that China policy does not end with the formulation of strategies. This is just the beginning. I mean, even though we have the feeling we are already long talking about investment screening in the European Union, or I don't know, now we have other economic security debates. So still, we are just at the beginning, So another topic that is always ignored in this whole debate is the lack of China knowledge within the different administrations and bureaucracies, not only in the European Union, but also within different national administrations. So, and I'm not talking about like China capacity and education, sinologists. I'm really talking about the knowledge within the administrations. And I mean, just as example, the German government, they published a China strategy, basically saying that they don't want to put any kind of resources in implementing this strategy. So this raises a lot of questions if we, to some extent, our policymakers take the China challenge that seriously in the end, Is this just talking, or at some point, I think there are many things you can do to increase, the knowledge of government officials on the working level, people who are confronted with Chinese counterparts on a weekly basis and that are not trained for this. So, and I think this is something that is not discussed enough, So we have these high-level meetings, and obviously they are well planned, and sometimes people make mistakes, sometimes not. But I think the bigger question really is, how can we communicate the many experiences that we have in Europe with China into knowledge that is actually used within the administrations and stays in the administrations and gives us also a strategic advantage when we deal with Chinese counterparts.
Neysun, over to you. You feel free to respond to what was the two panelists said, or pick up on any of the points that they made earlier.
Yeah, and I should preface by saying that so much of what I've learned about French-Chinese relations, I've learned from Philippe, and so much of what I've learned about German-Chinese relations, I've learned from Nadine. So if I make any glaring errors, blame them. Don't blame me. It's their fault as my guides to this landscape. So if I was looking at this from the vantage point of, let's say, the Chinese leadership or Beijing, I think it remains very much the case that Europe presents a different posture than the US. There is clearly some separation there. And the European, and again, Europe is a complex place and there's lots of different dynamics, but in broad terms, the European posture has not only been different from the U.S. posture, but has exercised even a little bit of influence on the U.S. posture. And Nadine just said the word de-risking. I think that's one of the best examples. For a long time in the U.S., the dominant language was decoupling, and we have shifted now to saying de-risking, I think, under the sort of the influence of kind of this European, slightly different posture. And then as the Chinese could look at the landscape of Europe, obviously there are some countries like Hungary that are, very much supportive of China. But I think for a long time, plausibly, they could look at Germany and see, especially German business had these longstanding relationships that they were keen to maintain. And so Germany provided a more receptive sort of partner landscape. What I would strongly urge them to think about, the Chinese leadership again, is that even though that is the case right now, the direction of travel in each of these European countries, maybe except for Hungary, but in general, certainly in France, certainly in Germany, certainly in other European countries, and in the EU as a whole, is towards the US position. There is still some separation, but the dynamics in each of those countries, you can see it building up. And that could be affected by this next U.S. presidential election. If it's the case that, the President Trump returns to power, he may not attend to transatlantic relations in the way that the Biden administration has, and that may have some effect on this dynamic. But even in that scenario, I would be willing to go out on a limb and say that the direction of travel remains kind of along the pathway towards where the U.S. is now. And these recent actions that Lyle, you mentioned, that German authorities have taken, I think is a good data point in that progression. And I don't think that the Chinese have at the moment a particular plan that will be effective for, halting that direction of travel or even moving it in the other direction. And to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent, I think because it is wrapped up with U.S.-China relations. As long as U.S.-China relations are in this very negative direction, at the end of the day, the Americans and the Germans, the Americans and the French, the Americans and other European countries, we will have our differences, but the alignment is vastly more robust than those differences. And that will have a hydraulic effect and, just agreement on some of those things to be concerned about, whether it's human rights, trade, China's coercive activities in the South China Sea, China's posture towards Taiwan. All of those things are going to continue to move the direction of travel in the direction that I've indicated. Maybe the Chinese think that they don't have to worry about that because they're developing, these other relationships in the global South, which we haven't talked as much in the auspices of this conversation. But, again, if I was in the position to sort of advise them or to give them some, recommendations from afar, it would be, you should worry about that. Like, it's not great if, the European countries and the Europe as a whole kind of move in this more hostile direction towards China. And that is the direction. That is, maybe Philippe or Nadine will disagree with me, but I do think in broad terms, that is the direction. And we're seeing lots of data points that support that.
Speaking of countries who are not moving in the direction of being more hawkish on China is Serbia, Hungary, where she is on his way to now. We're at a few minutes left. I just want to go around the horn. We touched on it briefly, but what message does it send to Europe that she is, going to France first, and then he's going to Serbia, Hungary, and of course, Hungary, we know Prime Minister Orban is very outspoken advocate of ties with China. He was, he went to the BRI conference. He's been courting Chinese investment. Kind of seems to be one of the outliers in Europe. Still not really saying anything negative about China. It's very positive, juxtaposed to Brussels. So, what do you all think about the significance of this trip? Obviously, you have the 25th anniversary of the bombing. Does that, is that a surprise to you? Did you expect it? Do you think that changes the dynamics of how France and Germany view its relations with Xi and China, or do you think that that's just to be expected? Maybe Neysun, I'll start with you, and then Nadine, and then end with Philip.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll say is that I think it's important again for the Chinese leadership to understand that the European audiences see all of this. It's not like they're only seeing the French visit, like they see the rest of it. And so I think if you're trying to kind of play this very subtle game of like one messaging here and one messaging there, like people see the whole thing. And, the Serbia-Hungary visit and then the immediate visit after that of Putin to Beijing, I mean, it's going to, these aren't like siloed containers where, like you have a French visit that's done, like we've established our view about that, and then we're not thinking about other stuff. Like, so all of this stuff, it impacts it. I would hope they have some sophistication about that, but it also could be that their main audience is not Europe. Like their main audience for all of this stuff is their domestic Chinese audience. And for that audience, maybe, this kind of what looks to us like kind of complicated and even contradictory messaging doesn't matter as much. It just demonstrates to a domestic audience that there's this trip to France, it was successful. Now there's a trip to these other partners that we have this other relationship with. Maybe that's all they care about. But if they did care about the messaging to European countries, they should think about that. They should think about the fact that this all looks like holistic. It's not like just siloed, look at it on this terms and then forget about the other parts of the messaging.
Mm-hmm. Nadine, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's not that surprising, to be quite honest, at least not to me. I mean, if you want to tell the China story well in Europe, then you obviously also need to find some place where it's sort of echoed, and I think that is the case in Serbia and Hungary. But also Neysun's last point is also important. I mean, clearly these trips are always like directed at different audiences, and so that is something we always need to keep in mind. That obviously what Xi does always also speaks to the Chinese at home. I guess the best outcome for the Europeans is, and that is, I don't even know if this is a European saying, but in German we have this saying, the first impression counts, the last impression remains. So in some ways, I would say if that is the case in the end, we are lucky, but I'm not so sure.
Well, I would just add, as a footnote that, in the past we had the 16+1 mechanism that China had set up to gather the Eastern and European countries together and speak to them on an annual basis. Now, this is now in deep freeze, and this is not gathering anymore. First of all, because 3 of these members have left and a number are questioning their membership. And for the good reason that not only China did not deliver in terms of investment as expected by these countries, but also the war in Ukraine, which is a terrible, dreadful aggression by Russia with so many civilian and military casualties, has sort of gathered these Eastern and Europe and Central and Northern European countries together. And they are now much more transatlantic than they were. So in terms of the Chinese diplomacy objective, this is not exactly an achievement when it comes to actually strengthening NATO, which was branded by the very same President Macron as brain dead a few years ago. And now it may be brain dead, but it's certainly not dead because it's very much in action, and NATO has now sort of been revived due to the war in Ukraine. So, and the other thing is, Hungary has played, of course, a very useful role as a hub for Chinese companies, and will continue to do that for car companies, for telecoms, for all kinds of manufacturing businesses that China. Hungary has been a convenient platform and will continue to do so. Now we'll see how long Mr. Orban stays in power. He's been there for 15 years. He's a Putin-like European leader, even though he's technically elected. But certainly he's considered as China's, reliable friend. And he going back to what Neysun was saying, he's a safe pair of hands in Europe. I don't think Macron is considered a safe pair of hands because Macron is part of the transatlantic world, and even as a member of the Security Council, you can see the breakdown between Russia and China on one hand, and United States, the UK, and France usually together when they vote resolutions about Ukraine, about the Middle East, or about North Korea for that matter, which is another the China ally, which we have not mentioned today.
Well, I'd love to keep asking questions or past time. Keen to get the readouts from these 2 trips from Xi and Serbia. Can't wait to see the pomp and circumstance with the 20th anniversary of the U.S. bombing of the U.S. NATO bombing of Chinese embassy. But certainly a lot of food for thought for this trip, and really thank my 3 panelists and guests, Philippe, Nadine, and Neysun, for joining me today. Just a quick note: if you're interested in more events from the Center for China Analysis, please visit our website and sign up for our newsletter, where you can get updates about events and activities and reports that we put out. So again, thank you 3 for your time. Really appreciate your insights, and hopefully we can do this again soon, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lyle.